August 6th, 1945, 0815 hours. Deep beneath the bustling, oblivious streets of Tokyo, 90 feet of reinforced concrete and 4 feet of steel-hardened walls shielded the Imperial General Headquarters from the reality of a dying empire. In this subterranean labyrinth, the air was stale, recirculated by humming fans that struggled against the humidity of a midsummer morning. Field Marshal Shinroku Hata sat at the head of a massive oak table, surrounded by the high priests of Japanese militarism, men who had spent 3 years meticulously constructing an illusion of spiritual invincibility. The briefing began as a ritual of managed decline. Maps were laid out showing the slow contraction of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, yet the tone remained defiantly optimistic. They spoke of Ketsugo, the decisive operation that would turn the Japanese home islands into a fortress where millions of civilians would die to preserve the emperor's honor. To these men, the war was a grinding attrition they believed they could still win by making the cost of American victory politically unbearable. They were waiting for a grand conventional invasion, a clash of steel on steel that would validate their warrior code. They had no idea that at that very second, miles above Hiroshima, the laws of physics were about to render their entire reality obsolete. The silence of the bunker was shattered not by an explosion, but by the frantic metallic clatter of a teleprinter and the sudden unceremonious entry of Lieutenant Colonel Teishi Yamamoto. He did not bow. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror as he clutched a fragmentary transmission from the Hiroshima Regional Military Command. As the message was read aloud, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Entire city destroyed by single bomb, unknown weapon type, casualties catastrophic. General Yoshiro Umezu, the chief of the general staff, snatched the paper, his mind immediately racing to find a logical explanation. He assumed it was a massive, coordinated raid, perhaps 500 B-29s dropping incendiaries simultaneously. But as the morning intelligence filtered in, the logical became the impossible. Radar observers confirmed that only 3 American aircraft had been over Hiroshima. Not 300, but 3. The High Command sat in a paralyzed stupor as the reconnaissance pilots reported a mushroom-shaped cloud glowing with purple and orange hues, rising 40,000 feet into the stratosphere. Then came the twist that chilled the room to its core. The transmission didn't just report destruction, it revealed that the Japanese radar net had tracked the planes for over an hour, but the command had refused to scramble interceptors for a mere scouting flight. In their arrogance, they had allowed the end of their world to fly in unchallenged, simply because it didn't look like a threat. By 10 o'clock hours on August 6th, the intellectual foundation of the Imperial Japanese Army began to crumble under the weight of a mathematical impossibility. Admiral Soemu Toyota stood before the massive wall map in the bunker, his eyes fixed on the coordinates of Hiroshima. The reports flowing in from the Chugoku military district were no longer fragmentary, they were apocalyptic. Reconnaissance pilots, sent to investigate the loss of communication, described a city that had not just been bombed, but had effectively vanished, replaced by a pulsing, multicolored cloud that rose higher than the summit of Mount Fuji. The air staff struggled to reconcile the carnage with the radar data. Only 3 B-29s had breached the perimeter. In 3 years of brutal air war, the destruction of a major urban center required hundreds of superfortresses carrying thousands of tons of incendiaries. The High Command was forced to confront a terrifying new variable. The Americans had somehow bypassed the industrial requirement of mass. If 3 planes could do the work of 300, the entire Japanese defensive strategy of attrition through numbers was dead. The silence in the room was heavy with the realization that the divine wind of spiritual resistance could not blow against a weapon that turned the very air into a furnace before a single shot could be fired. The morning turned into a grim interrogation of reality as Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first detailed eyewitness account from a railway official who had been 15 miles outside the blast zone. The man's testimony, recorded with trembling hands by Togo's secretary, described a flash that didn't just illuminate the sky, but seemed to rewrite the laws of nature. A light brighter than 1,000 suns. He spoke of a pressure wave that derailed trains and a firestorm that consumed the city center in a single heartbeat. In the afternoon session of the Supreme War Council, the tension reached a breaking point. General Korochika Anami, the Minister of War and the most vocal advocate for continued resistance, desperately clutched at the shred of hope that this was an elaborate American hoax. Propaganda, he spat, his voice echoing through the reinforced concrete. They want us to believe they possess the power of the gods to force a surrender without an invasion. But Admiral Toyota countered with the brutal truth. Japanese radar had tracked the 3 aircraft with surgical precision from Tinian to the drop point. There was no deception, only a terrifying new leap in scientific capability. The shocking twist came when the intelligence analysts presented their first rough calculation. The energy released in Hiroshima suggested that the Americans had achieved in secret what Japan's own nuclear program, NIGO, had deemed a century-long impossibility. The realization was clear. While Japan was fighting a 19th-century war of spirit, the Americans were wielding the fundamental power of the universe. As the dust of Hiroshima settled into the lungs of the Imperial High Command, the ghost of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto seemed to haunt the underground bunker. In a rare moment of reflection, the council was forced to look back at the origins of their catastrophe, to November 1941, when the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack had issued a chilling warning that was now being fulfilled with terrifying precision. Yamamoto, a man who had lived in America, studied at Harvard, and toured the sprawling industrial heartlands of Detroit and Pittsburgh, knew a truth that his colleagues in the Army had spent 4 years denying. He had famously told the naval staff, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." He understood that America was not just a rival nation, but a sleeping industrial titan, whose steel production alone exceeded Japan's total national output. While the army leaders in the bunker had built their strategy on Yamato Damashi, the indomitable Japanese spirit, Yamamoto had tried to warn them that spirit alone cannot stop a mass-produced tide of iron and fire. In the dimly lit corridors of the bunker, the generals realized that Yamamoto's 6 months had long since expired, and the 3rd year had brought with it a weapon that no amount of spiritual fervor could deflect. The tragedy of the Japanese leadership lay in their systematic rejection of Yamamoto's mathematical reality in favor of nationalist fantasy. In 1941, the Army's strategic planners had convinced themselves that the vastness of the Pacific would cause American logistics to collapse under their own weight. They believed that the soft American public would beg for peace after losing 40,000 men, never imagining a nation that could lose 400,000 and only grow more determined. As Admiral Toyota reviewed the wreckage of their strategy, he recalled how Yamamoto's warnings were dismissed as defeatism by the very men now sitting in silence. The shocking twist in this realization was the discovery that Japan's own intelligence services had actually provided accurate reports of American industrial expansion throughout 1943 and 1944. They had documented the launch of cargo ships so rapid that it outpaced the U-boat sinkings and the production of 300,000 aircraft. The High Command hadn't failed because they lacked information. They had failed because they had created an environment where truth was treason. Yamamoto had foreseen a war of attrition that Japan could never win, but even he could not have predicted that the American industrial machine would culminate in a single city-killing device that rendered the warrior's heart completely irrelevant. The tension in the bunker shifted from existential shock to cold numerical dread when Colonel Hideaki Sato, a senior intelligence analyst with a reputation for unsettling honesty, stepped into the light of the briefing room. While the generals spoke of divine winds and warrior spirit, Sato had spent the war obsessing over the rhythmic, unstoppable heartbeat of American factories. He opened a thick, red-stamped folder, a reality assessment his team had compiled over 6 months, a document that had been suppressed by the War Ministry until the fire at Hiroshima made the truth undeniable. Sato began to recite the numbers with the clinical detachment of an undertaker. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States had produced 88,410 tanks. Japan had struggled to assemble 6,450. The Americans had launched 141 aircraft carriers of various classes, while Japan's fleet had been decimated and never replaced beyond a handful of hulls. Sato highlighted the most terrifying metric. American ammunition factories produced more shells in a single week than Japan's entire industrial network could produce in a month. As he spoke, the generals looked at their hands, realizing that for 3 years they hadn't been fighting a war of maneuver, but a war of simple, lethal arithmetic that they had lost before the first shot was fired. The final blow came when Sato turned the page to the section on scientific mobilization. He revealed that while Japan's nuclear research, the NIGO project, had relied on a few dozen underfunded scientists in a single laboratory, the American effort, the Manhattan Project, had operated on a scale that bordered on the mythological. Sato's intelligence network had documented the construction of entire secret cities like Oak Ridge and Hanford, consuming more electricity than the city of Tokyo itself, and employing over 130,000 people. The cost of this single American project was $2 billion, more than Japan's entire military budget for the year 1944. The shocking twist in Sato's presentation wasn't just the existence of the bomb, but the realization that America had achieved this gargantuan feat while simultaneously fighting a 2-ocean war and maintaining a civilian economy so prosperous it still produced butter and nylon. Sato closed the folder and looked directly at General Anami, his voice dropping to a whisper. They are not merely stronger than us, General. They are operating on a different level of civilization. They fought us with one hand tied behind their back, and with the other, they rewrote the laws of the universe. The atmosphere in the bunker reached a state of surreal exhaustion as the council members grappled with the implications of Colonel Sato's data. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, the Navy minister, leaned back in his chair, staring at the concrete ceiling as if trying to visualize the sheer scale of the American continental machine. The realization was bitter. While the Japanese Empire had cannibalized its own society, forcing schoolgirls to dig for pine root oil and stripping metal fences to melt for shell casings, the Americans had achieved total victory without ever truly feeling the pinch of war. Reports from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirmed that American civilian life remained almost untouched. While Tokyo was starving and living in the shadows of firebombings, the American public was enjoying record-breaking peacetime levels of consumer production. The Americans weren't just winning, they were winning as a side project. They had managed to equip the British and the Soviets with millions of tons of material through Lend-Lease, effectively funding and arming two other world-class militaries, all while simultaneously conducting the most expensive scientific experiment in human history. The merchants of death, as Japanese propaganda had once called them, hadn't just produced guns, they had produced an entire world order, while their own citizens never missed a meal. This revelation shattered the last pillar of Japanese military pride, the belief in their own unique capacity for sacrifice. For years, the High Command had comforted themselves with the idea that the soft, individualistic Americans lacked the warrior's heart to endure a long conflict. But the atomic bomb proved the opposite. It showed a level of cold, calculated determination that was far more terrifying than any bayonet charge. The Americans hadn't bothered to meet Japan in a decisive battle of spirit because they had moved the goalposts to a field Japan didn't even know existed. They had fought the war with one hand tied behind their back, holding their full industrial and scientific potential in reserve until the moment of total annihilation. The shocking twist in this realization came when the cabinet secretary, Hisetsune Sakomizu, presented a diary entry from a captured B-29 pilot. The American hadn't written about glory or the emperor. He had written about the high quality of the ice cream served on his base and his plans for a college education after the war. The generals realized with a sickening clarity that they had been fighting a titan that viewed the destruction of the Japanese Empire as a logistical hurdle to be cleared before returning to a life of luxury they couldn't even imagine. The dawn of August 9th, 1945 brought a double-edged blade that sliced through the final delusions of the Japanese High Command. While the generals were still debating the scientific anomaly of Hiroshima, a new nightmare erupted from the north. The Soviet Union, the very power Japan had desperately hoped would broker a neutral peace, had declared war. At midnight, Stalin's hammer fell as 1.5 million Red Army troops surged across the Manchurian border in a massive, coordinated pincer movement. The elite Kwantung Army, the pride of the Imperial Japanese military, was systematically pulverized by Soviet tank columns that advanced 50 miles in a single day. In the underground bunker, the news of the Soviet invasion was received with a silence even more profound than that of Hiroshima. It was the collapse of their last strategic pillar. For years they had told themselves that Stalin would never side with the capitalist West, but now they saw the Red Army equipped with tens of thousands of American-made trucks and field phones, yet another manifestation of that inexhaustible U.S. industrial machine. The map was no longer a game of defense, it was a shrinking cage closing in from every compass point. The Council's despair reached its zenith at 11:02 hours when a second lightning bolt struck the home islands. The report from Nagasaki was chillingly brief. Second atomic attack. City destroyed. Casualties catastrophic. This was the second shadow that changed everything. If Hiroshima was a shock, Nagasaki was a message of infinite capacity. It proved that the Americans didn't just have a bomb, they had a production line. Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai spoke with a brutal, unprecedented candor. The Americans have demonstrated they can destroy our cities at will, one by one, until nothing remains. Our anti-aircraft systems are irrelevant. The shocking twist in this moment was the reaction of the die-hard Minister of War, General Anami. Even as his beloved Kwantung Army was being liquidated and his cities vaporized, he argued that the Americans might only have a few bombs left and that Japan should still seek a decisive battle. But the realization was already spreading among the others. The Americans didn't need to invade. They could sit back in safety and simply delete Japan from the map, city by city, without ever setting foot on the soil they had vowed to defend to the last man. The final collapse of the Japanese military psyche was not completed in the silence of the bunker, but on the sun-drenched deck of the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. As Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Uemezu stood before the Allied delegation in Tokyo Bay, they were confronted by a physical manifestation of power that no intelligence report could truly convey. Surrounding the massive Iowa-class battleship was a forest of steel, hundreds of American warships extending to the horizon, an armada so vast it seemed to cover the water like a carpet. Above them, the sky was literally blotted out by a formation of 450 B-29 superfortresses and hundreds of carrier planes, a roaring canopy of aluminum that served as a final, crushing reminder of the unfair geometry of the war. General Uemezu, the man who had once calculated that Japanese spirit could overcome any material advantage, looked at the Missouri itself with a hollow expression. He realized that this single ship, a masterpiece of radar, heavy armor, and 16-inch guns, had been built in an American shipyard in less time than it had taken his staff to plan a single failed naval operation. The illusion of parity was gone. The Japanese representatives realized they weren't just surrendering to a stronger army, but to a civilization that could produce a battleship as easily as Japan produced a bicycle. The ceremony was a masterclass in psychological dominance, orchestrated by General Douglas MacArthur to ensure that the Japanese leadership understood the scale of their miscalculation. As Shigemitsu leaned on his cane to sign the instrument of surrender, the silence on deck was heavy with the weight of 4 years of systematic self-deception. The shocking twist in this moment was the realization that this colossal American presence, the thousands of sailors, the mountains of high-tech equipment, and the nuclear-capable bombers overhead represented only a small fraction of the total U.S. military force. The Americans had buried the empire while simultaneously rebuilding Europe and maintaining a consumer economy that far exceeded Japan's peacetime peak. Shigemitsu noted in his diary that the Americans didn't need to shout or threaten. Their simple presence was an overwhelming statement of fact. The warrior spirit had been defeated by a nation of merchants who had proved to be the most efficient killers in human history. As the fountain pens touched the paper, the High Command finally accepted the bitter truth. They had been fighting a war of 19th century ideals against a 20th century industrial god, and the result had been decided the moment the first American factory line shifted into high gear. By 1947, the dust of the atomic fires had settled, but the psychological ruins of the Japanese High Command were still being picked over by historians and occupation officials. In the quiet interrogation rooms of Tokyo, men like General Yoshijiro Uemezu and Admiral Soemu Toyoda finally articulated the brutal post-mortem of their empire. The lesson learned too late was not simply that America was stronger, but that the very foundation of Japanese strategic thought, the belief that spiritual willpower could overcome material reality, was a catastrophic delusion. They had spent a decade preparing for a war of the 19th century, only to find themselves fighting a scientific titan that operated on a different plane of existence. Intelligence Colonel Sato's final report, now archived in the National Institute for Defense Studies, offered the most stinging indictment. Japan had lost the war in December 1941, not because of tactical errors at Midway or Guadalcanal, but because they had attacked a civilization they never truly understood. They had mistaken American democracy for weakness, diversity for disunity, and wealth for softness. In reality, Those very traits had funded a scientific machine that could simultaneously feed its people and develop the power of the sun in secret. The ultimate irony of Japan's defeat was the realization that American power had never been fully deployed. During the post-war interviews, Japanese officials were stunned to learn that while they had committed every man, woman, and child to a desperate suicide defense, the United States had fought the Pacific War with comfortable margins. The Americans had maintained a massive reserve of forces, developed next-generation jet aircraft, and built a global logistics network, all while their civilian economy reached new heights of prosperity. The atomic bomb wasn't the cause of Japan's defeat. It was merely the final, undeniable proof of a disparity that had existed since the first day of the war. General Umezu's final testimony to occupation historians summarized the tragedy of a generation of leaders. We believed our own propaganda when we should have believed our intelligence services. We learned too late that courage cannot defeat chemistry, and spirit cannot overcome steel. The shocking twist was that the very warrior spirit they relied on had actually blinded them to the truth, creating an information environment where honesty was viewed as treason, ensuring that the empire would only wake up once there was nothing left to save but the ashes.